10 brutal attacks on prisoners by prison guards. Welcome back to Creepshow, where we dive deep into the darkest corners of reality. Today's episode is a chilling reminder that violence behind bars doesn't just come from fellow prisoners. It can come from those meant to protect. In this video, we'll uncover 10 brutal attacks on prisoners by prison guards. These horrifying stories show how power can corrupt, leading to devastating consequences. Let's get into it. Number 10. Ronald Spear. Ronald Spear, a 52-year-old man, was arrested after trying to buy medicine from a Harlem store where he had been banned for a prior theft. Due to his deteriorating health, diabetes, heart problems, and reliance on dialysis for his end-stage renal disease, Spear was placed in the prison infirmary. He walked with a cane and wore a fall prevention bracelet. For days, Spear repeatedly demanded medical care, but his pleas were ignored. Desperate, he tried to push past Officer Brian Call to seek help. In response, Call violently struck Spear in the face and stomach. As Spear fell, 2 other officers tackled him, pinning him face down on the floor. Call, consumed with rage, began kicking Spear in the head repeatedly, like he was kicking a field goal, according to one of the officers present. One guard tried to intervene, shielding Spear's head and pleading with Call to stop. But Call leaned down, lifted Spear's head, and said, "This is what you get for king with me. Remember I did this," before letting his head drop. Spear never moved again. The brutal assault caused a brain hemorrhage, and his already weakened heart gave out. In an effort to cover up the murder, Call convinced the other guards to report that Spear had attacked them with his cane. Years later, one of the officers, Anthony Torres, overwhelmed with guilt, confessed to what had really happened. This led to Call's arrest. When police searched Call's home, they found a framed newspaper clipping about Spear's death in his bedroom, a grim trophy of the crime. In the end, Brian Call was sentenced to 30 years in prison for Spear's murder. Spear's family later won a $2.75 million lawsuit against New York City, but the memory of his brutal death remains a sobering reminder of how abuse of power can turn deadly. Number 9. Michael Tyree. Michael Tyree, a 31-year-old man struggling with bipolar disorder and addiction, found himself in jail after breaching probation for a minor drug conviction. Instead of being placed in a mental health facility, he was held in a special needs unit of the jail while awaiting transfer. His time there would end in tragedy. Tyree frequently refused his medications, which led to a confrontation with the prison nurse. After an argument in which he pocketed his pills instead of taking them, a guard was called to intervene. The situation was de-escalated, and Tyree eventually agreed to take his medication without further incident. But later that night, 3 guards returned to Tyree's cell with sinister intentions. The guards, Jerry Lubrin, Matthew Ferris, and Rafael Rodriguez, savagely attacked Tyree, kicking and punching him repeatedly. Other inmates could hear Tyree's desperate pleas as he cried out, I'm sorry! Stop!" Despite his pleas, the guards showed no mercy, leaving him crumpled on the floor of his cell, battered and broken. Hours later, officers discovered Tyree's lifeless body. He had been left naked, covered in vomit and excrement. An autopsy revealed that Tyree had died from severe blunt force trauma. His liver and spleen ruptured from the beating. He had died within minutes of the attack. The subsequent investigation revealed that the guards had a history of abusing inmates, particularly targeting mentally ill prisoners. Text messages between the guards showed that they boasted about beating inmates in areas of the jail not covered by security cameras. They even laughed about the suffering of those they were sworn to protect. Lubrin, Ferris, and Rodriguez were all convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. In the aftermath, Santa Clara County officials settled a wrongful death lawsuit with Tyree's family for $3.6 million. Number 8. Randall Jordan-Aparo. Randall Jordan-Aparo, incarcerated for credit card fraud, endured a slow and agonizing death after prison staff ignored his worsening medical condition. Jordan-Aparo suffered from an inherited blood disorder that caused severe symptoms during his time in prison. Despite his repeated complaints of blood in his mouth and urine, medical staff refused to help. When he sought assistance, a nurse threatened him with disciplinary action rather than offering care. As his symptoms deteriorated, a nurse finally called the prison doctor, who advised that Jordan-Aparo should be administered intravenous fluids and kept in the infirmary. However, after several failed attempts to insert an IV, the nurse gave up and left him to fend for himself overnight. The following morning, Jordan-Aparo was in even more pain, pleading for hospitalization. When the nurses refused, he warned them, "I'll sue your king ass. I need to go to the hospital." Instead of receiving the medical help he so desperately needed, the nurses called the guards. The guards dragged Jordan-Aparo out of the infirmary and into an isolation cell without any medical advice. In a gross display of overkill, the guards deployed 600 grams of toxic gas into the cell. Inmates nearby could hear Jordan-Aparo's desperate cries, "I can't take it. I can't tolerate gas. I need a nurse." After being forced to shower off the chemical residue, Jordan-Aparo was so weak he required a wheelchair. Despite this, he was returned to the isolation cell, which was still coated in the hazardous orange residue from the gas. Hours later, Jordan-Aparo was found dead. His lifeless body was discovered on the floor, his face pressed against the door, as if in a final attempt to breathe through the small opening for fresh air. Despite the disturbing circumstances of his death, no one was charged in connection with the incident. Number 7. Matthew Walker. Matthew Walker, serving a 20-year sentence for burglary and assault, was brutally killed by prison guards over a missing cup and magazine. It all began around midnight when Walker was abruptly woken up and questioned about the missing items. Frustrated and disoriented, he responded, "This is crazy. You woke me up about a cup," and refused to move. The situation escalated when the prison officer called for backup. Walker's cellmate witnessed the horrifying attack that followed. When Walker refused to comply, the guards ordered him out of his cell and began their assault. One officer pepper-sprayed Walker, and the confrontation spilled into the hallway, where other inmates watched in shock as officers punched, kicked, and struck him relentlessly. After being handcuffed, it became clear something was wrong. One of the guards noticed that Walker's pupils weren't responding and called for medical assistance. When a medical response officer arrived, they described Walker's head as feeling like Jell-O and commented that they must have kicked his ass. Sadly, it was too late. Walker was dead. The medical examiner later confirmed that Walker's death was caused by a crushed larynx and neck swelling that closed off his airway. His body showed at least 11 distinct injuries from the beating. Despite the overwhelming evidence of brutality, no one was charged with Walker's death. Number 6. Samuel Harrell. Samuel Harrell, an inmate with bipolar disorder, tragically lost his life after a brutal encounter with prison guards. Harrell, delusional and convinced he was going home despite having years left on his sentence, packed his belongings and ran headfirst into a locked exit door. This sparked a violent response from prison officers. Harrell was quickly tackled to the ground and handcuffed. What followed was a savage assault by at least 20 guards, including members of the notorious Beat Up Squad, a group known for targeting inmates. As they beat him, they hurled racial slurs, kicking and punching Harrell with no restraint. After the beating, Harrell was either pushed or dragged down a flight of stairs. Witnesses recalled seeing his body lying on the landing, bent in an impossible position. Despite the brutality, corrections officers downplayed the situation when calling for an ambulance. Rather than report the assault, they claimed that Harrell had likely overdosed on synthetic marijuana. However, the autopsy later revealed the truth. Harrell had sustained multiple bruises and wounds to his head and body, and there were no drugs in his system. His cause of death was listed as heart arrhythmia, following a physical altercation with corrections officers. Despite the clear evidence of the fatal beating, no one was ever charged in connection with Samuel Harrell's death. The unsettling story of Samuel Harrell is just one of many where those in power turned violent, with devastating consequences. Stay tuned as we continue to explore more of these harrowing tales. Number 5. Martin Harrison. Martin Harrison was arrested for failing to appear in court for a DUI charge. During his booking, he informed a nurse that he was a daily drinker and would likely suffer from alcohol withdrawal. Initially, the nurse placed him on a withdrawal protocol, but later discharged him without any follow-up care. Soon after, Harrison developed delirium tremens, a severe form of alcohol withdrawal that causes hallucinations and erratic behavior. In his cell, he began screaming, destroying a meal plate, and flooding his toilet. When deputies entered his cell, Harrison, believing someone was trying to kill him, attacked in a state of panic. In response, 10 deputies swarmed Harrison, hitting, kicking, and repeatedly tasering him. After subduing him, they transferred him to another cell, restraining him with a waist chain, leg shackles, handcuffs, and a spit hood. A nurse examined him soon after, but Harrison never regained consciousness. He died 2 days later in the hospital. The coroner's report cited cardiac arrest following excessive physical exertion, multiple blunt injuries, and tasering as the cause of death. An investigation revealed that Corazon, the prison's healthcare provider, employed cheaper licensed vocational nurses instead of the state-required registered nurses. Harrison's family later won an $8.3 million lawsuit against Corazon and the county. Number 4. Richard Metcalf. Richard Metcalf showed no previous signs of mental illness, but one winter morning, he left home barefoot and tried to break into his own catering business. When officers arrived, Metcalf resisted arrest and was tased twice. Held in a cell awaiting arraignment, Metcalf soiled himself during transport and needed a shower upon arrival. However, he panicked during the transfer to the showers, forcing officers to subdue him. Afterward, Metcalf told hospital staff he got beat up in jail. Back in the detention center, his behavior worsened. Metcalf began punching and biting himself and banging his head against the jail bars. Officers, struggling to control him, shackled his hands and ankles. When Metcalf started spitting blood, they placed a spit mask over his face. However, when he chewed through the mask, they covered his head with a pillowcase. As Metcalf's condition deteriorated, officers called for an ambulance. Medics tried to remove the spit mask, but found it had been tied so tightly around his neck that they had to use scissors to cut it off. By that point, Metcalf had stopped breathing. Though doctors managed to revive him briefly, he was declared brain dead soon after. Metcalf had suffered 4 broken ribs, extensive bruising, and organ failure. No charges were filed in connection with Metcalf's death. Number 3. Leonard Strickland. Leonard Strickland, a man suffering from schizophrenia, was imprisoned on a charge of weapon possession. His mental health struggles made him vulnerable, but it was a violent altercation with jail officers that ultimately led to his death. According to the guards, the incident began as an act of self-defense, but the testimony of 6 independent inmates told a much more chilling story. Strickland was beaten by a guard and forcibly thrown down a set of stairs, with one officer reportedly using racial slurs during the attack. As he tumbled down the concrete steps, his head struck the ground repeatedly. By the time he reached the bottom, Strickland curled into a fetal position, where 3 officers continued to kick him in the head and ribs. After the assault, Strickland was taken to the jail's ER for evaluation. Video footage showed him struggling to stand before collapsing. Despite his deteriorating condition, officers took him to the mental health ward, hoisting him by his arms, which were tied behind his back in a hyperextended position. After a brief time in the ward, Strickland was removed from the room and dropped in a corridor, left lying face down for about 10 minutes. When officers realized Strickland was no longer breathing, they attempted CPR, but it was too late. An ambulance transported him to the hospital, where he was pronounced dead. Despite the brutality of the incident and the conflicting reports from witnesses, no one was charged in connection with Leonard Strickland's death. This tragic story highlights the dangers that vulnerable inmates face in environments where force is used indiscriminately. Join us as we uncover more brutal tales of violence inside the prison system. Number 2. Larry Trent. Larry Trent, a 54-year-old man, was arrested for DUI and held in jail because he couldn't afford to post bond. 4 days into his detainment, a routine action by deputies William Howell and Damon Hickman turned violent and led to a tragic outcome. When Howell and Hickman opened Trent's cell to retrieve a sleeping mat, Trent attempted to flee. Howell quickly tasered Trent, rendering him unconscious. Instead of simply returning Trent to his cell, Hickman kicked him in the ribs while he lay on the floor. As they continued to assault him, Trent briefly managed to grab the taser from the officers, but they soon subdued him again, holding him down while continuing their violent assault. The brutality escalated, with Howell and Hickman punching, kicking, and stomping on Trent, leaving visible boot prints on his face and torso. Howell entered Trent's cell and delivered another kick to his head before locking the door. Blood from the beating stained the cell, the hallway, and the booking area. But rather than seek medical attention, the deputies ordered other inmates to clean up the blood. Despite Trent lying on the floor, bleeding from an open head wound, Howell and Hickman refused to take him to a doctor, fearing repercussions. Hours later, another jail employee found Trent unresponsive. Emergency services were called, but it was too late. Trent was pronounced dead at a local hospital. The autopsy revealed he had died from a fractured pelvis, which led to internal hemorrhaging, along with blunt force injuries to his head, body, and extremities. For their roles in the attack, Howell was found guilty of excessive force, obstruction, and neglecting Trent's critical medical needs. Hickman pleaded guilty and received a 10.5-year sentence. Trent's family later won a $275 million settlement from the jail. Number 1. Darren Rainey. Darren Rainey, a 50-year-old schizophrenic inmate serving a 2-year sentence for cocaine possession, faced a horrifying death in a Florida prison. 4 months into his sentence, Rainey refused to clean himself, prompting correctional officers to take extreme measures. Instead of leading him to a standard shower, the officers took him to a specially rigged one in a nearby janitor's closet, where they could control the water temperature. They locked Rainey inside, threw him a bar of soap, and turned the water on. The temperature soared to over 71 degrees Celsius, 160 degrees, far beyond the state's legal limit of 49 degrees Celsius, 120 degrees. As the scalding water burned his skin, Rainey's pleas for mercy were ignored, with officers reportedly mocking him as he begged to be released. For nearly 2 hours, Rainey was left in the boiling water. By the time officers returned, he was dead. His skin had shriveled and peeled off, floating in the water. Prisoners were ordered to clean the shower afterward and were warned to stay silent about what they had witnessed or risk becoming the next Darren Rainey. Despite the obvious signs of abuse, the prison's medical examiner claimed there were no burns or external trauma. However, a preliminary report, which was never released, indicated there was visible trauma throughout his body. A nurse later revealed that Rainey's body temperature was so high that it couldn't be measured with a standard thermometer. His death was ruled an accident, attributed to schizophrenia, heart problems, and confinement to a shower. For years, no investigation was conducted, and no one was held accountable. It was only after an inmate contacted the press that the story came to light. Following media attention, several prison officials were fired, but no one was charged with Rainey's death. Rainey's family later won a $4.5 million settlement from the state of Florida and other responsible parties. Those were 10 disturbing accounts of prisoner abuse at the hands of guards, each one a tragic example of how justice can go terribly wrong. It's a stark reminder of the vulnerability some inmates face, even when they're already under the law's control. If this video opened your eyes to the dark reality behind bars, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another episode of Creepshow. Stay safe, and we'll see you next time.